let me just say for the two groups, the everyone who's in place in the ICF and everyone who is attending online, thank you so much for joining. And I thought, Rachel, to hand off to you, um, putting on the table kind of one of the major takeaways that came up in the previous private discussion about the complexity of what we're trying to do, that it's a historic effort in so many ways. The idea that we need to uh, completely retool transportation, completely retool the underlying manufacturing components of that, the complexity of the manufacturing, the complexity of the devices that we're inventing and putting into the marketplace, the historic nature of the effort. Rob, that should give you a perfect landing point for the concept of the ecosystem and the social dimension. So that's all that I really wanted to say, was just thanks to everyone in the preceding session for the wonderful insights, and thanks to everyone who are joining us now for this vision conversation about electrifying transport. And that's it from me.
Okay, yeah, it was a really rich discussion. I mean, we ran out of time, really. We could have gone on for another hour at least on some of these issues. But the bottom line is just the complexity. I mean, just looking at lithium-ion batteries, right, and for electric vehicles, and that's not including when you expand into broader markets and looking at secondary markets, secondary goods. When you start looking at affordability, access, electrification, and all of those things. Because a lot of the materials that may be recycled from these may be pushed into those markets, and not just here in the United States, we're talking globally. And so we have a wide range of regulations, policies, and standards to consider. Very little insight really into that as far as standardization and what applies when it doesn't, jurisdictional differences, different classifications, definitions, which we had a really interesting chat during our previous roundtable. And so so now we're looking at like the broader ecosystem, right? So give us well. So let me first introduce Robert Kleinbaum here. He has been a part of GM for many years. You're a former technical fellow there. Now you are the CEO of Mission Driven Energy, which is a nonprofit that is working on affordability and socioeconomic factors. And so your company focuses on looking at the dangers of the energy transition, right? And what it means to many different societies that may get left behind, the poorest of countries, and even here within developed economies as well. And so looking at the broader ecosystem concept that we were talking about in our prior discussions, and that we've had conversations online about, give us, lay it out for us. Give us your vision. How do you see all of this fitting in?
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for the kind introduction and sort of passing me a ball. Now I'm going to kind of take it. I'm not sure I'm going to take it exactly where you want me to, but I'm going to take it to sort of where my heart is, and that's the issues of equity and inclusion and the kind of mess we're in now, but how we might be able to get out of it. And the solution will actually lie in the complexity of it. So just very briefly, the energy transition, and by that I mean the introduction of renewables, solar energy, EVs, they've left the poor behind. They've left the disadvantaged behind. The median income of people that have solar rooftops, twice the median income of our national income. Never mind, poor people, which are low moderate income, which is something like 40% of the of that income level, and it did that not because of malevolence in anybody's heart, not because somebody said, oh, let's just really stick it to poor people, because we always do that and it's so much fun. It's just sort of the way our economic and regulatory system worked. The problem is that with the way things are going, those people will continue to be left behind. And you might say, why should we care? It's just, okay, it's a market outcome. Not everybody gets anything. There are a couple of really important reasons that we need to care. One is that income distribution will simply grow worse. Okay, what will happen is people that in lower middle income neighborhoods, I'll give sort of a simple example, will not be able to own electric vehicles even when they become affordable. Why? There's no place for them to put chargers. 2/3 of all households, 1/3 of all households, 2/3 of all rental households have no access to charging. Okay. All right. So what's that mean? Well, it means for one thing, they're going to live in neighborhoods that are have dirtier air, and there'll be health impacts. Another reason to care is that EVs, and this is not, it's not quite really understood yet. When EVs can send energy back out, and you can use it to power your house or power the grid, it's going to be worth on the order of $500 to $1,000 a year to the owner of that vehicle. It's a lot of money. Okay. They're not going to have access to that. Okay. So they're going to be chopped off of a fairly serious income source. Okay. And the question is then, why do we care? Well, other than the fact that we care, I think one reason I got into this is realize that income distribution in the U.S. is a real problem, as it is in a lot of Western societies, and this is going to worsen it. Our social fabric is kind of fraying as it is. Okay. We're not going to be able to decarbonize the electric fleet unless people can access used EVs. Okay, so I'm doing a project in El Paso where they're kind of very concerned about this, and there's a neighborhood called south of the I-10, and you look at a block, 45 houses, not one can have a charger in it. Nobody has a household. A charger or a garage. And somebody said, everybody there driving 98 pickups. Okay, that's correct. Everybody's driving 20-year-old used vehicles. Okay. Well, the problem is, if our vehicle fleet, 95% of our fleet is used vehicles. Only about 5% are new vehicles. Okay. Well, if the people that would normally buy used vehicles can't buy used EVs when we come to the market, we're not going to electrify the fleet. Anyway, there are a whole series of problems like that what I want to do is get a band of brothers to look at sort of solutions to fix it. But I've talked too much. Why don't you ask me a question and kind of poke at me, and I'll turn it back to you.
This is good. This is good. And you know, I love that the focus is on diversity, equity, inclusion, because I think in our conversations around energy transitions,
Yes.
Here in the U.S. And other parts of the world, you know, those are the factors that get lost in the discussion. And yes, now there's a push in this administration for including environmental justice, and we've had some pieces of that in NEPA legislation. But by and large, it really has fallen to the wayside, and it's been. In many ways, you know, one could argue, you know, a check the box kind of exercise. And we start
Yes.
looking at energy transitions, and you know, it's, you know, especially when you start looking across life cycles and supply chains, and you start looking at all of the social impacts, the environmental draws, and things that we're not capturing, things that we don't have data for, things
Yes.
that we don't have access to. It paints a very different picture, and especially when we start looking and including like the you know, upstream activities like mining, or end of life activities like we've been
Yes.
talking about today, you know, recycling. It's gonna require, you know, the build out of a lot of infrastructure, and you know, as we build out our circular economy, include things like remanufacturing and redistribution. I mean, those are additional facilities, more recycling facilities, hazardous waste, landfills, and you know, as we know, I mean, there's tons of data that show EJ communities being adjacent to,
Yes.
or you know, within EJ defined communities, you know, according to EPA's you know, data and others' data, and even that fall outside of the U.S. And so there's a whole range of challenges that we do have to consider, especially when we're looking at underserved communities and so forth. And so you do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa.
I want to, not yet. I'm going there.
Well,
Okay.
yes, and so you're branching out into that area, which I think is interesting because not only do we not pay enough attention to things like social equity and environmental justice, we also don't really consider what happens in within our own economies and lower to middle income economies, but also in developing countries, because a lot of, as we expand our knowledge on life cycle insights and supply chain issues, we're seeing that there's a lot of impacts that happen outside of our borders. And so it's interesting to look at what's happening in say sub-Saharan Africa, because they are set to be have the largest population like by 2040, over what, like 1.2 billion people. And so there's enormous opportunities there for things like remanufacturing and recycling, and there's also a push from a lot of the governments within Africa to electrify and to adopt electric vehicles, and that comes with some challenges. And so if you could expound on some of that, maybe, because they're a very energy starved country.
So can I paint might be, and maybe it's just like a dream. Okay, this is something that has to be sort of penciled up. That's why I sort of left GM fairly recently to start this. Right now, what is it? Something like 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa have no access to electricity.
It's
Zero, none,
it's just
not
less
so
than
ever.
half the population.
Right.
Yeah.
$1 a day income. They're cooking with wood and coal, the two most dangerous fuels for both health and for carbon. Okay. The problem is that because it's a fairly the population is sort of spread out, and transmission and distribution costs have not come down the way generation costs have, it's not feasible to connect them to a grid. So the obviously, okay, microgrids. Well, the fact is, microgrid economics just don't work the way they're currently configured for most of these villages. People talk about microgrids in the sense of resiliency, and that's great, that's wonderful. We're not talking about resiliency, we're talking about powering the bloody light bulbs, so that people can work. I know this is a long path, so just let me kind of get there, because I'm going to bring you back to recycling. Okay. The problem with microgrids is that the load levels are too low in order to justify the fixed cost, and the cost of storage are also too high. The stationary storage is hideously expensive. Okay, now come to EVs. EVs, another fact that a lot of people get but don't quite, it's kind of free storage. If you have an electric vehicle, and I'm going to use in the United States, it will have about 100 kilowatt hours of energy in it. About only 10 is used. Well, if you're going to use that for a storage mechanism, it doesn't cost you really anything else. It does cost you a little, but nothing compared to what, say, an 80 kilowatt hour battery would be. In Africa and in much of Asia, two-wheeler electric motorbikes and very small utilities are all going to electrify, and they're going to be the dominant method in which people can travel. Okay. Those vehicles can provide both load and storage for small-scale microgrids. And suddenly you're developing a system where transportation, storage, and generation might all make sense. And I qualify it, might make sense in much less dense environments. Okay. What that will permit is getting hundreds of millions of people out of financial poverty and permitting an industrial base to happen. Okay. Suddenly these people can sort of join the modern economy. Okay, so now where are we going to do recycling? Where can we have the kind of manufacturing can do it? Suddenly, and maybe this is just a crazy extension, suddenly Africa becomes a source of manufacturing capabilities. Okay? Why? Because there's power, there's basic needs, there's sort of small scale, you can have small scale manufacturing. I don't know what the right scale is, but suddenly a whole realm of possibilities open up. And I don't think, and one reason I sort of wanted to sort of get going on this area is I think people really care about this, but I don't think people put enough sort of creativity and imagination to things that we might do because we've introduced all this complexity. Okay, EVs have changed the game. It's a totally different game now. All the rules, the formation, the pieces, how they fit together, the relationships, they're all up in the air. And there's a tremendous amount of value that's being generated. Okay, well, that value can be used then to deal with justice and equity and inclusion. Okay.
Well, so let me ask you a question about, the two-wheel electrified vehicles in the case of like sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world that might mirror that economy, right? Like, parts of India, Southeast Asia. So, I mean, lesser developed countries, they rely on high quality secondhand imports or low quality secondhand imports of high quality goods, and used vehicles account for like 40% of the exports globally.
Yes.
And U.S., Japan, China, we export our vehicles, a large portion of our vehicles to places like Africa and Eastern Europe.
Yes.
and Asia. And so in those cases, like where their market is dominated by used vehicles, like it's a super high percentage.
Yes.
And vehicle affordability rates are extremely, like the average cost of a car is like $6,000.
Yes.
And the cost to replace a lithium-ion battery is double that in many cases. And so, I mean, how does that work, and how do you see that all playing out?
I think that's a really interesting idea, and so we could absolutely be in a scenario where an EV, say in the United States, has been used sufficiently where its where its capacity and its range might no longer be acceptable in the U.S. Okay, but it's still useful as a vehicle. It just doesn't get as much range. That's what's going to happen with sort of as the EVs become older, right? The capacity and range are going to decline. It's not going to decline as much as people think it is, by the way. All the real life examples we've seen so far, all the battery sim lab results suggest those vehicles are actually going to last a bloody long time. Okay. Be that as it may, when they do reach a point where it's no longer acceptable here, and let's say the range degrades from probably 400 miles, 300 miles to 150 miles, well, that might be just perfectly fine, okay, as a second or third vehicle or even a new vehicle in a lot of these markets. So it would be a way to sort of electrify, and it would be a way to reuse our vehicles in a way instead of having send them to recycling, okay, and then help them electrify these economies that would, be much slower to it and might not be able to afford it. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting thought.
And do you think, and this is just a general question about energy transition in general, because we often talk about energy transition from our perspective, from a very Western perspective, right? But as we both know, every country is in a very different phase of consumption and transitioning. Yes. And for those economies, that are still relying on traditional biomass for heating and cooking and underdeveloped, cook stoves. I mean, is it premature or a bit like OECD centric for us to kind of push these higher cost electrification, mobility, onto countries that don't have the ability to pay?
I feel very, very strongly about, and maybe people for whom climate is the only thing that counts would disagree with me. We're not going to keep people in poverty and have them pay for our sins, our carbon sins of the West. Okay, it's simply not going to do it. It's not going to happen. And I think it's immoral to advocate that happened. So these countries are going to have to electrify, they're going to have to, for between sub-Saharan Africa, well, okay, our countries like that, they're going to have access to electricity. If it's not electric, it's going to be coal, okay, or whatever the cheapest one is. We're facing a Foreign Affairs article called it a carbon tsunami, okay, that it's going to be this great increase in greenhouse gas emissions. If that is if the sort of the historical outcome has happened in the rest of the world, United States, Asia, they up the level of their economy on coal, okay, if that happens in Africa. So we need to find a solution where they're not paying for it, okay? And if that means we subsidize it, that's okay, but I think we would first we think of more interesting business models and more interesting technical solutions that would let it happen, okay, in an economically sustainable way, because the subsidies themselves are going to be there's not enough subsidies in the world, so we have to find a solution.
I mean, yeah, or integrate technologies, that can capture the carbon and,
Yes.
in ways that doesn't inhibit the society from developing, where they can tap into their own domestically abundant natural resources, but do it in a way that manages those emissions.
But see so that's why the electric bikes and small utilities, one of the most popular vehicles in China right now, and I hate this COVID thing, it's been such a pain for everybody in the world, right? This small little utility, small little thing, smaller than this table, okay, that is all electric, that everybody thought would fail. It's one of the most popular vehicles in China. Well, it meets the transportation needs of a lot of sort of emerging market economies. Rwanda, now for two-wheelers, Rwanda has now mandated that all its motorcycles, and it's one of those countries that's full of motorcycles. Most of you probably traveled to Asia, and if you've ever been to Jakarta, and you see this wave of bikes coming at you, and they're all loud, polluting, two-stroke things, right? Okay, Rwanda has said its entire entire motorcycle fleet has to be electric in 3 or 4 years. Okay, several 100,000 vehicles. That now provides a potential energy source that could be used for all sorts of grid purposes. Okay, if we're sort of clever of how we think about it, if we understand what the drive cycles are, if we understand how it might be used to power businesses, if we understand how it could be used to sort of lessen the capacity needed on the grid, how it could be integrated with renewables and change the energy economics, that's, I think, sort of direction we have to look for economically sustainable solutions.
Yeah, and thing is, like, the public perception, right? I mean, we're starting to see like factions even within the environmental community, right? Within activist local communities, where you're starting to see this emergence between like environmentalists and preservationists. So, goes back to like Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, and one has a more utilitarian viewpoint, the other to entirely preserve natural resources. And so, I mean, how do you factor in public opinion, and where is that balance between the social and the environmental and the economics?
So I want to
because everything,
okay,
everything, like everything from like even like importing hydro from Canada, wind and solar, all those things. There's so much pushback now on everything, transmission. And so it's like, how do you find that balance to get past that and to progress to the point where we need to?
So I'm not sure, but I think there's some rays to hope. First of all, everybody needs to understand they have a stake in here. But the problem is you can't market electrification on its virtue, okay? It's only a very small portion of people that will want to have an electric vehicle because it's very good, and those are a lot of people, the leaders and the environmentalists. What needs to happen, and what is happening, is once EVs, frankly, become affordable and sexy, okay, when you have nicely styled vehicles that are all the body styles, and they're cute. People will want to have them. Right now, for large portions of the population in the US, and especially low and middle income communities, it's like, these aren't for us. They're rich white guys' playthings, or they're people that don't like us, okay? If we can get over that, and I think we will, okay, and then we do something to, say, put infrastructure in neighborhoods where people might not normally consider it, okay, which I think there's some really interesting business model solutions. Suddenly, it's not a matter of environmentalists versus economics. It becomes a natural economic force that happens because it's almost a byproduct of what they want. And that's what I think we have to kind of work for. And we need to take it out. We're not going to achieve widespread electrification on the basis of just arguing about greenhouse gases. The number of people that care about that is large, and it's growing and large. Most people just want to live a life, okay? And we need to make it kind of easy and fun and normal for them to sort of participate in the energy transition, not something they pay for.
Well, yes, they need to be a part of the process, definitely the decision-making process. And I think with the rise in ESGs and Scope 3 emissions, there's going to be more of a push for disclosures on all sorts of things, including social and equity.
That's just going to continue. I think that's just going to continue.
I do too, yeah.
And it's going to drive major corporations. So a lot of companies have bet their life on electrification. General Motors is one company, my former company. They've bet their life on electrification. Okay, it's not a question. It's not a gimmick. It's not a thing. They've bet their life. Okay, and that's a lot of other companies are doing that as well. And it's for ESG considerations, for Scope 3 considerations. It's for Scope 3, probably everybody here gets a jargon, but I know we're at the Baker Energy Institute, but it means that you're sort of the users of your product and the suppliers of your product. Okay.
So all the
It's
ancillary.
all that. It's like it's like the entire Megillah, as we say.
And I just have to say this because I always say it. Like with the Scope 3 emissions, I think at some point we're going to have to go beyond just looking at emissions, right? And that's a part of what you and I do with pushing like the environmental justice, social equity, because that is so very important. I mean, the human and social dimensions are key to an inclusive and just energy transition.
They're totally key to an inclusive and just energy transition, and the energy transition will not happen. Actually, you said it. You gave this great quote when we were sort of talking earlier, that a decarbonization strategy should, by definition, be an environmental justice and inclusion, an equity and inclusion strategy. Yeah. And I could not agree with you more. And in order for that to happen, we need to kind of put an equity and inclusion lens on the entire sort of set of factors that determine our energy system. What kind of generation do we use? Where do we place it? We put EV infrastructure, where does it go? Okay. What is our rate structure? And why do we have a rate structure that's so regressive? Okay. We have to find solutions to the equity and inclusion problem within those larger issues. So here's a simple one. Okay. The notion of virtual power plants has received a lot of attention. So virtual power plant, just to recap, is you have a bunch of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles will collectively be able to provide enough storage at scale, okay, that will be very, very meaningful. Okay. So it needs to be aggregated. This to give you a sense of the scale that will be available in 2040, McKinsey just came out with a report that said in order to achieve our COP climate goals, you're going to need, I forget, the 1.5 to 2.5 terawatts of power in storage, with about 70 to 80 terawatt hours of energy. Okay. EVs could provide 1/3 of that by themselves. Okay. So there's huge value at stake. So come back to a virtual power plant. Okay. Why not create a system where we put infrastructure on streets in lower middle income neighborhoods, okay, which we can do. Now it's some interesting business models to make it happen, so people in those neighborhoods can charge. Okay. We find a way, and maybe it's through tax incentives or tax credits, so people in that neighborhood can own EVs. Okay. And then we aggregate those into a virtual power plant, and maybe it's the income from that that supports the inclusion of the infrastructure and whatever subsidies. So we need to be thinking about how to put these pieces together to give us environmental justice and equity, and I think there will be some cool ways of doing it that will be really exciting. But I could just be kidding myself, but I don't think I am.
Well, I mean, going back to like developing economies, because
Yes.
I think that's where you know, your focus is, and you know, a lot of the talk on electrification is being pushed on. I mean, it makes me think about like informal sectors, right? The informal economy, and in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, Africa in general has the largest informal economy in the world. I think that it's like over 2 billion people, and in sub-Saharan Africa, it makes up like 90% of the economy. So it's like the backbone of the economy,
Yes.
and 9 in 10 urban workers and rural workers are considered informal workers. And so how do we include this, like this shadow economy, and make sure that they continue to grow and thrive? Because you know, a lot of our you know, a lot of the solutions, they don't work well in informal economies, right? I mean, and there's years and years of data that tell us that bringing in traditional, say for example, traditional recycling systems, or you know, even if we're talking about circular economy, so remanufacturing and things like that, is highly counterproductive. And trying to establish a formal system when you have all of these informal societies that are kind of, you know, working to you know, in their own areas, and you can argue, right, that they work, you know, they do circularity better than we do here. I mean, look at the collection rates for some plastics in Asia. In PET plastics, like over 90% were collected by the informal sector. In Brazil, like 90% is done by the informal sector.
So I think so first of all, if I had a really good answer to your question, I would just, you know, we wouldn't be in this mess, right? It's so complicated. But I think what you just said is perhaps the key. If the informal sector, say, that's a great example where they collect 90% of the plastics, because the money they can get is sort of makes it worth it in the informal sector. So there's a market.
Keeping things at economic value.
There's a market that's created. They can access it, okay, and it makes sense for them to. And my guess is that exactly the same thing will happen in the electrification and decarbonization, but we have to give them the sort of the tools to let it happen. And I think it really will be in the sort of small scale transportation systems that are bi-directional, that will create all sorts of opportunities that markets will take care of it themselves. And we're already kind of seeing some hints of that. There's a company in Taiwan called GoGoRo that some of you might have heard of, and they are selling inexpensive two-wheel motorcycles with swappable batteries. And they have these swappable battery systems all over, and it's taking off like crazy. Well, without any prompting or anything else, there's now people thinking about, oh, there are these banks where the way they do it is batteries are like 20 pounds. So, you know, a small woman is quite capable. A child can take them in and out without stressing. These batteries will be in a bank, okay, in urban neighborhoods to start. Okay. Well, that's a heck of a lot of storage just sitting there idle for large periods of the time. How can that be used to balance the grid, to provide storage for integrating renewables? Okay. People will think of that on their own if there's some priming and they're just given sort of permission to do it and the regulatory system doesn't choke them off. Okay. And I think there'll be 1,000, I hope, that's probably acceptable. I think there'll be some really creative solutions that will come up that are unanticipated. We kind of have to throw the ingredients out there for it to happen.
Excellent. Let me check the time here
What is our
because
time? I have no idea.
10 to. I do want to open it up for
Should we open up for questions? Yes. I feel
because
like
I'm
I've been
sure
talking too much.
there's a lot of thoughts here, and let me start right.
Yeah, quick question. All the problems you've been going through here, virtually all of them could be solved by a shared ownership model for vehicles, not just shared infrastructure. Why are we not seeing that emerge and, with more force, or will we?
Well, and I'm going to.
Go ahead.
Let me jump in really quick too, because and that's a part that's one circular economy business model that we're starting to see a lot of emergence in our sharing platforms, and I think was it Toyota in Japan just came out with its first battery electric vehicle for lease only, and so I think we are going to start seeing more of that, the extending your product life cycle. So that it doesn't turn over into recycling, and so you don't increase the draw on demands of additional materials, for ownership. And so I think it is emerging, and it will continue to emerge, Rob.
So if we can do, I mean, I agree. There'd be huge advantages if we can have a shared economy. The problem so far is that our experiments, at least in the United States and Europe, haven't worked out very well. The shared platforms, they just don't work. And I've had some friends that started Maven, and you get these stories like, okay, it sounds great in practice, but then what happens is drug dealers take them, okay? Or there's a body in a trunk, their favorites of hitmen. So you have to do stuff, you have to have a system that, okay, it works great, in theory and in practice, and if you can make it work, it's wonderful. But it kind of has to be also consistent with the cultural norms and behaviors of the people
That's right.
unless you're just going to kind of mandate it. So yeah, anything we can move to make sort of shared economy work, yeah, it'd be great. I'm not sure it's the answer for the reasons that I just said, sort of cultural barriers, people not willing to do it, people wanting to have ownership. What is an interesting question is shared ownership over charging. Okay, which might, just 1 second, sir. And because charging often has excess capacity. And my guess is something people are much more willing to share than vehicles. Well, if you're willing to share charging in that fashion, then suddenly a lot more people can get access to it. So yes, but I think it might be more something like what I just said than actually sharing the vehicle, just based on our experience.
This actually fits right in what you're saying. So the other night, for the first time, I got into an Uber that was a Tesla. And so I discussed the whole economics of this with the driver. So the driver actually is from a neighborhood that is a disadvantaged community. He has no power, no electric vehicle recharging in his neighborhood. But this works really well for him as a driver of his economic fortune, because he pays, I think it's leased, Uber does all this, and they lease the vehicle through Hertz to the drivers. And he pays something, it sounded ridiculously small, like $380 a week, which he can make all of that in one day. Okay? He tells me what he does is he will drive, say, about 150 miles, and then he'll recharge it. And he'll go to one of these charging stations in the middle of the day. He uses that time as his break time, and then he'll go off and do his next part. And he actually told me that he had like a Tesla S, so it was a pretty darn nice car. And he said, "Yeah, I'm going to get one of those, X ones because I want to do, Uber Black." And he was already expanding his business model with this.
Brilliant.
And it came back, it really seemed to fit within this shared model, and also maybe partly an answer to your problem of having charging stations, as long as there's
Yes.
close enough to the community.
Yes.
He was able to access it. He didn't have to have it actually at his home. So I just thought that was.
That's a brilliant thing. It's a
Well,
great,
no, but
great
then
story.
I guess it follows up. I would
Yes.
like to see if you have further thoughts based upon that experience.
Well, it's an example of people left to themselves can improvise great solutions, right? And so you just, to my earlier comment, you kind of have to throw stuff out there that, and people will make it happen in ways that are unanticipated, and what you have to do is create the possibilities. I think that's going to be just as true in emerging markets. It's so in most of Asia and in Africa, Uber and Lyft, it's all two-wheelers, right? If you go to Jakarta, it's all two-wheelers. Okay, and which kind of scared me when I was in Jakarta, but anyway, be that as it may. And so you can see exactly to your shared point, sort of a shared transportation system, maybe that would all kind of work in exactly that fashion, yeah.
Well, earlier you said the charging station was an issue in the neighborhoods. You didn't see it in the neighborhoods. And I guess the engineer in me says, well, why, when you buy an electric car, don't you buy a charging station with it? Which, to me, a home charging station should be in the $500 to $1,000 range. If you go to the Ford commercial where they're plugging in the house for
Yeah.
that's $2,500 or more.
So the short answer is they don't have a garage and they don't have a carport. There's
Well,
literally
you
no.
don't need that. You got them out in the middle of nowhere in the parking lots.
Unless people can charge, I think, EVs at their home, okay, it's going to be a huge barrier to entry.
I agree that they need to charge at home.
Okay.
That is for the common commuter, homebound, or home-based person.
Right.
You need to have the charger there. But those are outdoor devices in terms of plugging it in. I
So
mean,
that's,
yes,
so,
you have to wire
so
it into
to
the
my
house.
point, so first of all, depending upon where you are, the $500 to $1,000 to $2,500 for the bidirectional capabilities, for probably most people here, it's like nothing. Why are we even talking about it? But if you're talking about a neighborhood where the median income is something like $30,000,
Yeah.
and 20%, 30% are below the poverty level, it becomes a significant,
Agreed.
it becomes a significant amount of money. Well, that's a very, very large portion, okay? And then the issue is, if you can't get it from the house, and taking it like an extension cord from your house and putting it out to your car is problematic in a whole bunch of,
Apartment houses are a whole new.
okay, a whole bunch of ways. Now in China, they literally put extension cords down from like the, like the third story window, and they're putting it out. That's, we don't recommend that at General Motors, okay.
But it has been done.
It has been done. It absolutely has been done. It's an interim solution. But now I'm going to come back to the U.S. What we can do is there is, I think, a system that could work, and we're going to experiment with it, I think, in El Paso. You do put in safe outdoor charging stations in residential neighborhoods. Okay. And one person had an idea is, they're putting in cable in the city right now. They're digging cable, okay, throughout the entire city. Now, cable's a franchise. U.S. law, if you're putting in a franchise you're giving franchise like to AT&T and Verizon, they have to do the entire city. You can't just do the expensive neighborhoods. Oh. Well, can we make infrastructure a franchise? Will a pencil? And especially then, if they're going to dig up all the streets to put in cable, can we put in conduit for charging? Okay. We're going to explore that. Maybe it'll pencil, maybe it won't. I don't know at this stage. But we need to start thinking, that's kind of the direction we need to go in to fix this problem. It's not going to be just taking an extension cord and plugging it. And especially if you live so maybe you live in the desert, it doesn't rain very much, but if you live in a place that rains and snows, it becomes especially
May not pass
problematic.
inspection.
Yeah, just to your point about the neighborhood and having something available for people to charge. I have, the last time I was in Las Vegas, I saw a parking lot that was rimmed by charging stations, public charging stations. Now, were they damaged? Were they being taken advantage of? I don't have the sense that they were. I have the sense, the knowledge that they were used because there were cars,
Going-
lined up to charge.
Oh,
The
I'm sorry, where were
hotels
these, ma'am?
perhaps did not I'm sorry?
Where was this?
In Las Vegas.
In what, where, in a residential neighborhood, or?
No, 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 this was among hotels.
Okay, yeah,
and
yeah.
so forth.
Okay.
But clearly the
Yes.
hotels didn't have enough charging stations. And so several of these organizations got together and put up charging stations. That maybe could happen in a neighborhood. I'm not.
That absolutely happen in a neighborhood.
Yeah.
And there are also different locations where it might be, one option might be churches.
Yes, or gas stations.
Our gas stations,
Gas
yeah, gas stations is it's though, gas stations has, EVs is, gas stations as locations for public charging make tremendous sense. They're already in the right locations, they're already wired pretty much for electricity.
Yeah.
And obviously people are used to going to gas stations.
And would that not solve the problem?
No, because I don't think so. We do have to do that. Okay, so having public charging is going to be critically important in order for EVs to become widely adopted. Okay, but those are going to be used mostly for topping off, as opposed to filling up. Okay? And for most, I do think it will have to be in the home or near enough to the home that they can drop it off, walk a block, otherwise, and let it be in for 5 or 6 or 7 hours, depending upon the size of the battery and the size of the plug.
Yes.
That I do think.
Well, so I think we are up on our time here, but I do, I want to circle back to the whole recycling, since
Okay.
we spent the last few hours talking about if recycling can close the material and metals gap
Yes.
of electric vehicles. And with all the energy and material input that goes into making a battery and the complicated supply chains, I mean, to me, it makes sense to extend the lifetime value of
Yes.
an electric vehicle, as opposed to throwing it into the recycling system where, we lose all of that good value, especially when the economics are not in favor of recycling right now. We have technical challenges and other constraints. And give me your final thoughts on that.
The final thoughts that I think it'd be wonderful if we can do it, but I want to do something, and in fact, you can think about a steady state system where that would actually work really, really well, just as it does now. As you said, all these used vehicles that end up in emerging markets very happily being used instead of being scrapped. I think for EVs, it's not going to happen for long enough because of the life of EVs. I don't think they're going to start showing up in volumes in order to go to emerging markets until mid-2030s, okay? Something like that. We're going to get volume manufacturing 2025. I think they're going to then probably be 12, 15 years later. That's maybe end of 2030s. So I want a solution that we can do now and put in place with the sort of existing markets, and then we'll transition out to that. So that would be my only issue that I would have, is I want to do something right now. Okay. Or at least that would be cognizant of how long it's going to take second-use vehicles to come back.
Right, yeah, there is going to be a gap in time, especially before a lot of those come to the end of life.
And these batteries are going to last a long time. These batteries EV batteries are going to last longer than internal combustion engines.
Well, we'd love to stay and chat
But-
about all of these
People probably
things so
want to
much
go have lunch or
further.
stuff like that.
So I want to thank you, Rob, for being with us today. I
Thank you
really
for having me,
appreciate it
Rachel. I
and your
really
time.
appreciate it. Michelle, thank you.
And thanks, everybody,
Thank
for
you.
joining us on this webinar.